We have a lot of Linux distros. Some might argue, especially if you go on places like Reddit, that we have too many Linux distros. And you know what? They might be onto something, but this has always seemed like a really weird statement to me because whilst we might have, let's say, a couple hundred, there's only a very small handful you'd ever personally consider using. And I don't just mean on your main rig. I mean, of all the use cases you could possibly have, there's only a very small number you would ever actually use. And an even smaller group actually doing something unique. And by unique, I don't just mean a whole different model, like a NixOS or Silverblue, or a source-based distro like Gentoo. Even something like Ubuntu is doing something very different from Debian. They have very different models. But this is what's true for you and me, the average Linux user, who know what these different distros are, who know about their strengths and their weaknesses, and know why you'd want to go and use one. But this is not everyone. There is a lot of people out there who see Linux who think, there is a lot of distros here. I don't know what these are. I don't know what they do. Why are there so many of them? So to me, I think of it as less of a problem of how many distros exist and more of a problem of how we talk about the distros that are out there. Because think about it like this. Let's say there wasn't a couple hundred. Let's say there was 10,000 distros that were actively being developed. Putting aside the ones that have been abandoned because nobody should be recommending those outside of educational purposes. If the only ones that are ever actively discussed and actively recommended are a very small set of, let's say, 30 distros, this is still a lot of distros, right? Like 30 is very difficult to choose from, but it's gone from a completely impossible task of 10,000 distros to one that you can manage with a couple of top 10 lists. Now, why are there so many distros is only one side of the question. The other side is, why bother making another distro? If all of these distros already exist, we have Ubuntu and Debian and Arch Linux and OpenSUSE and NixOS and Fedora and, I don't know, pick other random, Gentoo, there's another one. A bunch of distros, and then a bunch of distros based on these projects. Why make another one? And I understand why this question exists, especially if you're approaching it from outside the FOSS world, outside the Linux world, and especially if you're not a developer, because a lot of people seem to forget that most of what exists in the FOSS world, whether it be a music player, an image viewer, a terminal, a desktop, a distro, most of these projects didn't start as big projects. Even the ones now that have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of users, most of these projects started as something by an individual for that individual. They never intended for it to be this massive thing that tons of people rely on. Now, there are very key exceptions to this, right? Things like the Ubuntu project, that started with massive financial backing from the very start. It had goals to be a big distro. But most of what we see out there is not Ubuntu. Most projects start off really small, and then if users feel like it solves their problem, they start using it. If developers want to work on it, they start working on it. And then over time, it gains momentum and becomes a bigger and bigger project. So let's look at some of the reasons why people decide to go and make a distro anyway. Sometimes a distro is started to solve a problem a developer has in their personal life. A great example of this is Nabara Linux. This is made by Glorious Eggroll, the same Glorious Eggroll that works on Proton GE. And this exists for a twofold reason. One, he wanted something easily configured for gaming, so if he needed to redeploy it on another system, he didn't have to go through all the steps of reconfiguring Fedora to make it the way he wanted it to be. The second reason is he wanted to have deep knowledge of a distro so he could deploy it on his father's computer, and if anything went wrong with the distro, because he was the one working on the distro, he could easily go and fix the problem and make sure it doesn't happen again. Now, Slackware may have fallen out of favor today, but it is still going. But Debian also had a very similar origin. They were both forks or both modifications of the soft landing Linux system SLS, because whilst SLS was a good distro for the time, it had a lot of problems. It was very poorly maintained because it was the 90s, no one knew how to maintain a Linux distro yet, and the developers wanted something better. That's how both Debian and Slackware formed. Sometimes a distro is a really great baseline, but a developer comes along and wants to use it for a very specialized use case and doesn't want to have to go and remodify it every time it's being used. A great example of this are the immutable distros out there. Fedora Silverblue is based on Fedora. It is an immutable version of Fedora, but then the uBlue project came along and took what Silverblue did and made it so there was a bunch of tooling to go and customize the images and make your own specialized version of a specialized version of Fedora. And the OS on the Steam Deck is another great example. Modern SteamOS is based on Arch Linux. Arch Linux is a fairly fast-moving, rolling release distro. That isn't really suitable for what the Steam Deck is doing. It wants to be a set release and then have new releases every so often. But it does work as a really great baseline to generate those images, because you have a system which is always pretty much up to date, so if you want to go and generate a new image on a new version, that's pretty easy to do. Stepping away from the immutable distros, pen testing distros. You don't need a pen testing distro to go and do pen testing. If you want to go and use Arch Linux, you can do that. Or you could use Black Arch, which has all of the tooling already present. If you don't want an Arch base, you could go and use Debian. Or you could use Kali Linux, which has everything set up for you. Neither of these distros need to exist. You could just use the base distro, but the developers thought, I do pen testing, I do this a lot, I want to redeploy the system, so why don't I have something that is set up for my specialized use case based off of this really great baseline? Sometimes a distro is made due to a disagreement in direction. The best example of this is Devuin, a fork of Debian without systemd, literally on the homepage. But it is not the only example. Sadly, the project has come to a close recently, but the Fun2 Linux project. This was made by the creator of Gentoo. But after leaving the project and then returning and basically seeing just how toxic the space had become, but still wanting to build off of the Gentoo tech, he decided to go and make another distro so he could actually go and do that without being surrounded by the mess that was Gentoo at the time. Gentoo has since cleaned up a lot since then, but there are a lot of people worried about whether the distro is even going to stick around. And sometimes a distro is made to bring new people into an ecosystem. Whilst there have been some tensions as of late and a request for a rename, the original reason the OpenSUSE project was made was to bring a community element into SUSE. This previously did not exist with only having the enterprise offering, and I am really curious to see what happens with OpenSUSE over the next coming years, whether they still have a strained relationship, whether it gets reformed, and what actually happens there. And sometimes a distro is made to continue the legacy of a project, and for this one, I've got a couple of examples all from the world of Red Hat. Firstly is, technically they are different things, but Rocky and Alma Linux. But they both exist for the exact same reason, and if a certain project was still around, they probably wouldn't be. They were made because of the loss of CentOS. CentOS was basically Red Hat Enterprise Linux minus the Red Hat branding. Yes, there is CentOS Stream, but CentOS Stream is not the same thing as CentOS, and the whole CentOS situation has been discussed to death, so I'm not going to talk about that again here. Go watch another video on it. And my other example is Red Hat Linux. Now, most of you, when I say Red Hat Linux, probably think of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and that is what they offer today, but that is not what they always offered. There was at one point a distro called Red Hat Linux. This is where they started. Now, Red Hat Linux didn't really go away. Instead, it merged into a different project, Fedora Linux. Red Hat Linux was the distro that Red Hat offered when they were more interested in the desktop and user and semi-commercial space before fully pivoting into the enterprise space. When they did that, they still wanted an offering in this space, but they decided to make Red Hat Linux a more community-oriented project, and Red Hat still serves as the legal oversight of the Fedora Linux project, but it's a lot more community-driven now and not directly controlled by exactly what Red Hat wants. And sometimes the distro's made just because. No other reason. They just want to learn some tooling. Maybe they're bored. Maybe they just want to make a distro for whatever other reason. And this is the reason that a lot of other things made in the FOSS world as well. Why is there 100 different terminals, window managers, image viewers, NeoFetch clones? They wanted to learn how it worked. They wanted to do it. They just like having fun with tech, and there's no bigger reason for it. They're not making it for other people. They just made it because they wanted to make it. And oftentimes the distros like this are not the ones you should be recommending to the average person. They're just made because somebody wanted to. They're probably not going to have good maintenance. They're probably not going to be long maintained. And it's probably just like a one-off thing. But nowadays, a lot of people have gotten a lot better at recommending the distros to use. We've moved past all of these nonsense lists where all of these basically dead distros are being recommended. There was a long time that SteamOS 2 was being recommended, long after the Steam machines, well into SteamOS 2 being a completely dead project. I don't really see that as much anymore, but there's still a bit of it. So when you see weird distros being recommended, which nobody should be using besides the developer, make sure to call it out. Because yes, it might be a good distro down the line. If it stays maintained, that's great. But something so new and something so untested should not be recommended to people who don't know what they're getting into. Stick with the normal things, stick with the mainstream things, and you'll be perfectly fine. I forgot to record the outro again. I've been doing that quite a bit recently. Anyway, if you liked the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe to the Libero page, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and my hair looks awful right now. I need to get a haircut. Like this.